Boy, is that efficiency or what? Prussian-like efficiency. Awesome. All right, do we have anyone from the audience who would like to make a public comment on our work session? You didn't have any cards? Okay. All righty. We will move right along to discussion of the removal of the road barrier on West Jefferson Street at Allen, and we have approximately 20 minutes budgeted for this. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to our city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. Tonight, the objective is just to give you an update on what has transpired and what kind of input we have been receiving from the public on a proposal to remove the road barrier at West Jefferson Street and Allen Street. I do want to say that at the end of our staff comments, I would like to recommend that on our next council meeting, September 8th, that with your approval, we would schedule a public hearing so that the council could one last time take any and all comments that might wish to be made by the public, and then following that public hearing, more than likely that same night, we'd like to offer a final recommendation in whatever form that needs to be, ordinance, resolution, whatever that could proceed with final action. If I could, we'll come back to that in a minute, but first I just would like to have our police chief and fire chief just make a few comments, because I think it's very important that the public understand that the rationale, the reason, the catalyst for staff bringing this matter to the city council's attention is public safety. We've had some serious concerns raised by our police and fire department on the current dead-end nature of West Jefferson Street, and I'm going to ask each of these individuals to take just a few minutes each, followed by Jim Karch, Public Works Director, with any final updates, and then we'll come back to the mayor and council. So with that, I'd like to turn to whoever likes to go first, maybe Brendan Hefner. You kind of share some of the police department's concerns with the current status quo and what you're recommending in the interest of public safety with West Jefferson and the dead end street there.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to thank Jim Karch for putting the information together for us. As we all know, when you're having your informational package, the barrier was erected in 1997 in response to some crime that was occurring in the area. There were drive-by shootings going on, and there was even a firebombing in one instance. But at that time, the police department, in concert with the community, felt that this might be a strategy that needed to be employed or at least explored in order to stem what was going on, and it in fact did. However, over the years, some new problems have occurred. As you'll see right there, where the barrier is, we now have people who choose to congregate there. They're not all young people, but we have some youth and some just unsupervised young people in that area, and also there at the park, as you see. And what is happening is we have people congregating there. The park is not a city park, so there was no law against them being there until it closes really at 9. So they're there, and they're also walking on residents' yards. There have been instances where people have been very disrespectful to residents. And quite frankly, now when we respond to calls in the area, calls for service, particularly if there's something urgent, i.e. a fight or something of this nature, as you can see with the dead end, there's really nowhere for us to go. It does really limit how we respond. You'll see the current configurations with the barrier and the proposed without. Now, strategically, when we come to an area, we like to get there as fast as we can from many different directions. What is happening, particularly if you look where the current barrier is, it allows people to run from the area on foot where we can't drive with our vehicles. So we're kind of forced to go one way, or we just can't get there in a fashion that we would like to. Also, residents, or if you come down there or get halfway down there and you see the sign, you've got to go blocks around in order to get back to the same location. I will tell you, if you read in the paper last Tuesday about a stabbing incident that occurred in that block, I happened to be working that night, and I went out there, and I will tell you, people in all different types of directions. That's what officer says after they had kind of confronted the officers. And of concern to our officers and myself is that if we ever had an officer down in that area and that call was put out and officers might be leaving the county jail or officers coming from other areas wanting to respond there, uh, running lights and sirens, they might come down Jefferson and then not realize it until they got there that that barrier was there. So it does impede our response time to the area, and as I said, strategically in how we respond to crimes in the area now. Um, Things are better there. There's different types of things going on, but nonetheless, we feel that very strongly that removing the barrier is in the best interest of the community at that time and in our response to the area. Thank you.
Okay. Questions from the council at this point? Okay, we'll go ahead and go, Mr. Kimmerling.
I actually
Oh,
have a
I'm so
question.
sorry.
Just a comment, Chief. I think this is a city park, right? Yeah.
Friendship Park, yeah, I think,
Parks and Rec
But-
take care of it. I mean, maybe it's not officially a city park, but Parks and Rec take care of it. Friendship Park.
Okay, well, I was listening, but we can't, some of the residents want us to stop people from congregating there. We can't stop people from congregating there until after, obviously, it closes. And I think those have been issues, so I may have
Okay.
misspoke then.
Police Chief, maybe what we can, Friendship Park, I think, doesn't, maybe by legal description, extend to where the barrier has been erected. And isn't that what you're referring to?
Yes.
The park is to the north, you're referring to
Yeah,
where the barrier is.
Barrier is,
That's where people move out of the park, legal description, onto what could be construed as just public right-of-way,
yes.
where they have a right to congregate. So the
That-
map
that-
doesn't
That
clearly
would be
show that.
correct. Thank you. Thank you.
Others?
Mr. Hales.
Okay.
All right.
Then Chief Kimmerling?
Mayor, Council, I'll be fairly brief. I'm going to echo a lot of the same comments you heard from Chief Hefner. I've also been down there when we had a stabbing down there just recently during the day. You put 20 officers down there, you put an ambulance down there, you put a fire apparatus down there, and guess what? We have somebody with a stab wound in the back of the ambulance, and I helped my guys for probably 3 minutes back the ambulance back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, so we can get that thing turned around out of there. With the fire department, if we need to get in front of a building, we need to get in front of these houses here. We don't have the option of going down to Allen Street and then hoping the ladder reaches. We got to get in front of the house. 3 or 4 fire apparatus down the end of the street, it's a nightmare. It's tough to get in there. It's tough to do any work down there. And it's just really, to be quite honest with the residents who live in that area, it impedes our progress to get down there and providing the service they need. I think most of you have heard me say before, I'm a real fan of the grid system. Anything that increases our ability to get around, especially with the vehicles we drive, actually enhances our ability to provide service to the community. So that's it for me.
Hold on, questions for council? Clarifications? Thank you, Chief.
And then last, if we could have Jim Karch and just kind of bring the council up to date with what we've done in the way of outreach and the results of our communication with the public.
Thank you, City Manager Hales. Mayor and City Council, big thanks to our communications manager. She really coordinated a lot of that effort and that outreach, and so we'd like to give thanks to her for that. We did mail out 80 actual mailers, survey mailers, to the area that you can see shown on the map with all the different addresses. It's in your packet for that map. We received a 10% response, which is 8 people, so it is not an overwhelming majority of people responding. We tried we took email, we took paper, we took every way, shape, and form to be able to get input that we could. We've had 2 public meetings in 2014. We even had one in 2012. So there have been extensive outreach on this issue to date. 3 of the people that responded 2 of the people live in the 700 block. One of them owns property, 2 properties in the 700 block. There were 3 other people who live in the 800 block of West Jefferson, and then the Salvation Army also responded. The other person that responded didn't tell us where they resided. We weren't able to get that information. So the overall response was 75% of the people, 6 of them wanted the barrier removed. 2 of the people did not want that barrier removed. So again, that was kind of in line with the public meetings that we had seen, that there were people, this is not a unanimous kind of representation of the people who live on that block. It's good for you to know that. But again, so that is the response from the survey. Questions?
See, Alderman Lauer and then Alderwoman Schmidt.
Just thinking outside the box, as I always try to do. If we find that temporarily we might need to bring a barrier back to the area, is there a way that we could do that cost effectively, Jim, on a temporary basis?
There's always options we'd have to look at. One of the difficult aspects with how the barrier was put in, uh, hindsight's 2020, but in 1997 it would have been great if we would have slapped up some curb and poured dirt over the pavement and had, the grass would have been difficult to grow, but it'd be a little bit easier for us to remove it. Unfortunately, the pavement was literally cut out and removed, so we'd have to go back in there. So anything we do, we'd try to, it's just this is a tough area. It's tough for the officers, it's tough for fire, it's as you see, it's tough for Public Works for us to do snow response. There's not the traditional hammerhead cul-de-sac. This doesn't have the ability for anybody to turn around, even if it was, even if you had, even if you wanted to keep it, there's not a good way for any of these pieces of equipment to turn around.
Alderwoman Schmidt.
Just want to offer that when I have heard less than enthusiastic response to this, some of it has to do with the two-way street. So you've got a one-way street, and then I think the proposal from the city is that it becomes a two-way street at Allen going east, and then of course when you get to Prairie, it's a one-way street again. Jefferson's sort of a kind of a difficult street to figure out which direction you ought to be going in depending on where you are. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is because I'm not an engineer, but I hear that comment and concern expressed.
Alderman Schmidt, you're correct. Actually, the staff really actually wanted to make the one ways two ways. We actually approached that in one of the public meetings. We actually presented that. I agree with you that right now we have Monroe and Jefferson are a couplet up until you get to Monroe. And once you get to Monroe, that's where you have the barrier, and east of that, it has to be two-way, obviously, because it's a dead end. But whenever we open that back up, if that were opened back up, if the council should choose to do that, then the difficulty is going to be the Salvation Army really expressed some concern with, since that was closed down in 1997, they've now put in a docking bay that they need to be able to pull up and back in, and that would be illegal for them to back in the way their operations currently are situated. So that was the difficulty because staff, we actually had looked at and kind of desired to either make all of that two-way, and there were some areas you'd restrict parking, or make all of that one-way and continue that on. But there were just operational issues for different people in different ways.
Alderman Fruin.
Jim, just to comment, when we were in the business of doing all the traffic calming, weren't there some situations, maybe some islands that we were putting in that were a deterrent to traffic, but yet accessible by the fire trucks and police that you could drive over them or through them or around them or something? Wasn't there some kind of a compromise?
That's a good recollection. Yes, there are the speed humps, and there were also the traffic calming circles. There were smaller circles, 6 Points, Colton. There were some different ones over on Royal Point. What actually we're finding, though, to be honest, is we're actually removing those and putting back in speed humps now because a lot of folks really didn't like them. They weren't that effective long term. They got very ugly. They were very difficult to maintain. But that's a viable, something else that can slow down folks as well.
Alderman Black.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Jim, for the work you've done on this. And I know Nora was working on it as well, and we had a number of people, chiefs, participated in the public meetings that we had on this. I'm glad to see this is kind of coming to fruition and as part of our work session today. And, I want to just kind of be fair, though, that it is not a unanimous, by any means, idea that people are supportive of. And in fairness, to kind of give the council some feedback as to what the negative arguments would be, and Karen, you can hop in here if you can think of any that I'm missing, is I have had some folks that live further down on Jefferson that are concerned about the traffic flow, that it might increase their traffic flow in their neighborhood. I've had some folks that have expressed concern about the neighborhood returning to kind of the crime issues that they faced 15, 20 years ago. But the impetus for this conversation, at least for me, was a number of the residents that live right there on that barrier who reached out and expressed the concerns that Chief Hefner had pointed out, that we have individuals that will congregate at the park and then they just walk over the barrier, and then it's very difficult for the police to hold them accountable for their actions. Some of the other negative feedback that I've gotten is that the residents who want to see it remain, the barrier itself, say that they've seen multiple police cars come whenever they're called for service, and that it's very rare that happens. But I would argue that this is something that I think it's time to remove. I mean, we've done a number of public feedback sessions, whether it be in person, online, via the survey, and then a couple of the neighborhood association meetings that I've gone to. It's always come up as a topic, and again, the support isn't overwhelmingly for, but it's definitely something that people said, yeah, let's give it a shot. We can always circle back to some of the ideas that we talked about with, if it doesn't go well, we can come up with a cost-effective way that doesn't involve ripping everything out and making a more permanent solution. So, I think we should move forward with this, but that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I think we had one of the sessions we had that both Alderman Black and Alderman Schmidt were there. We had, I think, about the same number of residents, might have been 8, and I think it was something like 6-2, might have been almost the same people who came to that, to the church out there. But anyway, other questions, comments on this before we move on? Okay.
Mayor, I
I'm
think that
sorry.
brings us to the last. So unless there's any opposition, what we'd like to do is on September 8th, schedule a public hearing so that anyone else could come. The council can take that testimony, following which then we'd give some recommendations and options for how the council could make a final policy decision. So if there's no objections to that, we'll schedule that public hearing for the 8th.
Okay. Any objections to that for 2 weeks from this evening, September 8th? Okay. Thank you. And now we will move on to item number 5 is pedestrian crossings on major highways in Grove on Kickapoo Creek and 6th edition infrastructure costs. And we've got 40 minutes, which is, we're like 3 minutes ahead of schedule here. So, City Manager, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to first talk about pedestrian crossings on major highways in general. You do have some good information, including a document entitled Grade Separated Pedestrian Crossings, authored by Walter Anderson. Mr. Karch and his staff were able to find this document together with some IDOT and Federal Highway Administration information on how they advocate that all government entities, both state and local governments, should at some point in time enact some policies dealing with how to ensure at least safe pedestrian and bicyclist crossings of major highways. I think even the other document really makes it plain that in this day and age we're trying to encourage more pedestrian, bicycle traffic, more multimodal. I think that's a good thing nationwide, where there's more of that emphasis. However, the city of Bloomington does not have any such policy. And I do recall even to my right, Alderman Fruin has raised a number of times about some of the concern on Veterans Parkway. We have had some fatalities under different circumstances of individuals trying to cross Veterans Parkway by pedestrian. In my career, I've seen, unfortunately, that pedestrian crossings are sometimes like vehicle and railroad track crossings. Sometimes it takes some serious fatalities, injuries, very bad accidents until there's maybe that inertia of trying to do something to improve the overall safety of getting traffic from one side of the railroad tracks to another. I think as a city, we will continue, as we continue into the future, see probably more and more pressure to have such a policy. And again, because I keep coming back to Veterans Parkway, the day could come when there will be more and more outcry or concern that isn't it time to look at a separated crossing, either a bridge for pedestrians and bicyclists to go over veterans or maybe a tunnel. So I think that is something we do need to consider as part of a future policy. I think even before getting to policy recommendations, more in-depth and detailed study analysis would be in order. Because if nothing else, financially, building these separated crossings can be very, very expensive. Um, because we don't have a policy, and because we, as I start out with Veterans Parkway, we're talking about a very heavily traveled major arterial, that kind of leads into the discussion of Kickapoo Creek, the sixth edition, and what we're dealing with right now, which is kind of the more the emergency. There's no doubt that going forward, the cheapest time to look at a separated crossing is before you get something built. And that's the case as we look at the sixth edition. We have an opportunity to consider whether or not we go with a separated crossing, a tunnel in this case, at less cost than coming back after the fact at some point in the future. But in my mind, it's hard to kind of ask you as policymakers to move in the direction of making a decision, even though there is that need to do so, without revisiting the fact that if we were to also talk about do we have other locations in the city that would be considered higher priority, yes, I think we would find them. And Veterans Parkway, in my mind, together with Empire and others, probably would rank much, much higher than Kickapoo Creek Boulevard. So just kind of keep that in mind. Nevertheless, we are going to talk to you tonight, give you a little bit focus on Kickapoo Creek, and what we have is a narrow window of opportunity to consider, do we spend some money, what could be considerable money, looking at a separate crossing at that location. So with that, let me turn to Jim Karch, who's going to share a little bit more of the specifics on Kickapoo Creek 6th edition and a opportunity to consider a separated crossing, but it does come with a very significant cost. Mr. Karch.
Thank you, City Manager Hales. There's a lot of information in your packet. We've bombarded you with quite a bit of information from from outside DOT agencies, other writers. In summary, it's just saying that as a city, whenever it's possible, you need to try to capitalize on those opportunities to convey our pedestrians, our people that are using bikes. That's ultimately, we would love a policy, and they also talk on a lot of those documents how a lot of the policies right now are locally driven. There's no the federal warrants that many times when we'll talk about four-way stops or traffic signals, there are federal warrants that we have to comply with. That's not the case right now. They have guidelines and suggested amounts, but there's no requirements. And so keeping that in mind, we bring this tonight to you as just a possibility. The possibility of whether as a council where you land on how you'd like to consider this for the future, because this really is about the future. This isn't about the now. This isn't about this will be, decades down the road where it really would be desperate to have the need for it. But it's good for you to be thinking that way of how far ahead do you want to be planning with our other current needs for the expenditure of those costs. So that's very much a policy level decision. But the situation is in 2005, the preliminary plan came through for this development. There were two different crossings, Black Oak, Kickapoo Creek for the bike trail. At that time, Black Oak was properly planned with an underpass to be able to convey students to the Benjamin Elementary School. Kickapoo Creek was ideally really not planned the right way. It would have been great to convey an underpass at that point back in 2005. It was not done. And so because of that, the preliminary plan shows a bike trail coming right up to Kickapoo Creek. It's, as you see in the memo, Hershey Road is very similar long-term. It's good for you to get a gauge on, that 18,000, 20,000, 23,000, very high volume road in the long term, that what Kickapoo Creek will be. Well, that's what students would have to be crossing. And not just students. We keep saying students, but people use this. Our constituents use that. Our constituents cross Hershey Road currently. So what we're saying is now would be the time. If in the future, down the road, council wanted to put something underneath, it would cost a lot more. So for that forward planning, we're looking at the different options. That's one of the options, but that's the main crux of the issue is whether or not you put in the pedestrian underpass. The other issue is whether we put in the bike trail to the west of Kickapoo Creek at all. That's another consideration, one of the other options. You can amend the preliminary plan and have it go down that bike trail, go down to Ireland Grove Road and get conveyed across what could potentially be the East Side Highway in the future. So there's all these different issues that, again, staff just wanted to make sure we didn't miss that opportunity to bring it before you for your consideration.
And Jim, just to clarify, does it, or as a question, does it necessarily mean that the city would do this, would have to be at the city's cost,
Thank
or
you
would it
for
be shared?
clarifying that. What it would be is if the city would choose to oversize this underpass. Right now, the developer has to convey the water underneath the road. The city, by the annexation agreement, has to oversize Kickapoo Creek. They have to oversize that infrastructure to be able to have a large arterial road. If we were to do the pedestrian underpass, the developer would have to do the engineering. They'd build it. We would inspect it as we do with other infrastructure. We would pay for that pedestrian aspect, the oversized pedestrian part of that conveyance, and then we would accept it long term, and it would be ours. Does that answer your question?
So it would be, it's the additional marginal cost, it wouldn't be the entire cost.
It wouldn't be the entire cost. There's already a cost to convey the water underneath there. It would be the extra cost to build the box structure to get the people underneath of it. And that's the $156,000.
And Mayor, if I could, maybe this would be a good time to bring up Jeff Jurgens, corporate counsel, to just convey to the council what we understand as the developer's willingness or unwillingness to consider any kind of sharing of the costs. Do you just want to give them an update on our communications with the developers?
Yes,
their
and
council?
thank you, City Manager and members of the council. As Mr. Karch was saying, we've outlined several different options within the council memo. Some of them indicate that the city would be paying a larger share. Some of them indicate that the developers would be paying a larger share. Well, the initial thought is, let's have the developers pay the, part of their share. But the developers have come back with the consensus, essentially, and Elizabeth Megley, their attorney, is here tonight. She can answer questions as well. But the initial concern is that because of the cost of this, it would stifle development, and they would not develop past this area. So it would essentially stop the development of the Grove in this area. Alternatively, I think they would probably also, and again, I don't want to speak for the developers, they would also question their requirements under the agreements to have to come up with their share of this. So with that in mind, we've basically outlined a few different options here, and if you want, I can very quickly go through the four different options. Option one would be to say, yes, we definitely want this underpass, and to take the position that it is a shared expense and that the developer has the obligation to assist in that. If that were to be done, again, the downside may be that the developer may say, we simply can't afford to participate in that, and thus we're not going to move forward with any development plans in that area. If they said, yes, it looks like that's a good idea for us, their likely expense for constructing their share of the underpass would be about $244,000. Ours would be about $156,000. So there's still considerable expense in that. Option number two would be to simply not require the pedestrian underpass, to let the plans go forward, have them grade for the bike path. Maybe the city does or does not in the future put the bike path in there, but there would be no underpass, and there would simply be not as the ease of crossing as what one would like, and that's certainly something that the engineering staff is highly recommending you not go with. Option number three would be to, as Mr. Karch said, to amend the preliminary plan to remove or move the trail, perhaps move it to a different area where we could potentially look at lower cost or an easier way to get across the street. And then option number four would be to go at it alone for the city.
in which the city would bear the primary expense for this, at which point we're looking at about $400,000 just to construct the underpass. So those are kind of the four options that we've come up with in terms of looking at this.
If I could just clarify, under option one, where we would say, yes, we're going to go ahead, we would want the developer to share in the cost, they'd pay 256? Was that the number?
I had 244,000.
Oh, I'm sorry, 244, and our share would be?
156.
Okay, I mixed those up as I was writing them down. Now, also, if the development, maybe this is a question for Jim or the city manager, if the development didn't continue, would we possibly save money? Are there additional immediate obligations that we would have in the growth subdivision? The city
Well,
taxpayers?
one way or another, I see eventually they'll continue. They may not immediately move ahead with the sixth edition. They could continue to shift to the east side of the project and do one of these other phases. But ultimately, when the east side is all built out, more than likely they'll move back to the so-called seventh and eighth edition continue. So even if there is some savings, it just may be temporarily. But as I do want to point out that even if there is no underpass, the trail will have to be brought up to the level of the road one way or another. But again, that could be done hopefully at very little expense. And I do want to point out, we did give the council, I think someone requested an update. This particular map that you should have a copy of does show the total city costs to date, the estimated future costs, which is prepared by the engineering staff on the entire Grove at Kickapoo Creek project. So I just want to draw your attention to that as well.
Okay. Questions, comments from members of the council? Alderman Black and Painter, in that order.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, staff, for this information. I think that we should be as proactive as possible in terms of making sure that we expand the Constitution Trail as needed. And I know that there's a lot of groups involved that are donating money to that. It may not have to be an entire city cost to it. When it comes to overpasses and underpasses, I just wonder if there's some way that we might be able to do, like, selling advertisement space to help pay for it. Maybe there's a way that we can get some income off of this, especially considering that every time I'm on the trail, people are out there, and that might be one way to help defer some of this cost in the long term.
Kind of like graffiti, but maybe on a fee basis.
Exactly.
Alderwoman Painter, excuse me.
Well, when I was reading over this, it really upset me. I had some sleepless nights over it. I don't even know where to begin. I guess I'll start with a quote from our packet where it said, "The annexation agreement requires the city to pay for oversizing sanitary trunk sewers, water mains, and pavements in the Grove subdivision. The annexation agreement does not require the developer to provide any notice of proposed developments which would allow staff to adequately budget for oversizing costs." Who drafted this annexation agreement?
Well, we know that.
Well,
It's the past.
I don't even want to say what
They're
I
not
think
here
of
anymore.
it, but it involves tar and it involves feathers. In the best of times, when the city's population was increasing, resulting in steadily increasing tax revenue, we could go with an agreement like this, not because it was a smart, good thing to do, but because it would fly under many people's radar. The taxpayers were getting no return on their investment here, but most of them weren't suffering in their own turf because there was enough money coming in to pay for their own infrastructure repairs while subsidizing the new development. And as long as people's own comfort levels weren't disturbed, nobody would say anything. But today, the population is decreasing along with our tax revenue. And we're bound to a really bad agreement to supply the oversizing for all of this new development. And according to this agreement, the developers aren't even obligated to provide notice of new intended development. That means we'll all have to defer maintenance, probably, on the crumbling streets and bursting water mains we already have to pay for this brand new stuff. And who's going to move into this development if the population is shrinking? At every turn, I see that this is a really sweet deal for the developers and a big loser for the taxpayers, which brings me around to option one, in which the city asks the developer to pony up $244,000 to pay for a $400,000 underpass. The developer has indicated that this option is cost prohibitive for them and may delay or permanently prohibit development of this area. Well, good. This train needs to be stopped. If the developer can't afford to pay for their own development, the taxpayers sure shouldn't be expected to. And if there's any way to get out of this hideous agreement or to amend it, it would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so, because otherwise the city and the taxpayers will be out millions. Thank you.
Don't hold back. Tell us what you think, Johnny. But, and I think we've had lots of discussions about this over time, but at this point, we do have to decide what is to move on. And I guess what you're suggesting is option one, where we ask the developer to step forward and pay $244,000 toward this. Other comments? Alderwoman Schmidt and then Fazzini.
I actually had, I think I want to reflect back on your opening comments, David, about doing this crossing versus other crossings. And I think I'm missing the big picture here. I know we're talking specifically about the Grove.
Right.
And Johnny, I agree with you. This was an agreement that should never have been crafted this way. That was a very different mindset, and nobody knew until Mr. Hales showed up exactly what we had signed on for. So that was quite an eye-opening experience when we realized that. But I'm a little confused about, we could put money into this and solve the specific problem, but how does that address the bigger question of our, if I look at this versus, crossing someplace on Veterans Parkway, for example, I'm missing the big picture here.
Yeah, let me just restate that again. I think first off, the Grove, Kickapoo Creek, got to keep in mind one thing that's fairly new is that the East Side Highway corridor, if the road is ever built, does provide a new western boundary or obstacle to the Grove going. It can't go necessarily any further west if that road is put in. Certainly the Grove can continue to go north, but it does raise the question, what really is the future daily traffic flow that's going to be on Kickapoo Boulevard at full build-out? I think that's something we don't have for you necessarily today, to say that here's the traffic that's going to be on that street at some time in the future. Without that data, it's going to be hard in the ideal world to kind of show this crossing in relationship to other existing at-grade crossings throughout the city, like Veterans Parkway. And certainly in the ideal world, it would have been nice for a couple of years ago maybe to put together a policy, doing some detailed analysis, prioritizing, some of the most highly traveled and maybe the potentially unsafe at-grade crossings that we have in the city, and then having the council adopt a prioritized list based on facts, data, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, we don't have that. So as I look at this and I think, let's say the developer doesn't participate, and we may be looking at $400,000 to $500,000, that begins to be somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe a little less than half of the cost of an aerial bridge over like Veterans Parkway, where we do know we've had some pedestrian auto fatalities, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we don't have enough research that's been done, similar to our other master plans, sewer, stormwater, facilities. We don't have that for what are truly some of the potentially unsafe pedestrian and bicycle at-grade crossings throughout the entire city, to compare that prioritized list with this Kickapoo Creek Boulevard, which is still, in its early stages of development. So I throw that out because when I think of the public, even if it does, granted, if they share in the costs and we minimize our payment here, I think there's a lot more advantage to consider option one if it's a shared expense. If there is no sharing by the developer and we're facing 400 to 500,000 to go it alone, that is a heavy financial cost given what could be some other very justifiable and higher priority existing crossings that probably would be better candidates to go and spend money like that for a separated crossing.
That's
Does
very
that help?
helpful. It's very helpful. Thank you. Just to follow up, it's either on Hershey or must be on Hershey Road in Normal, where there's a at-grade crossing to, is it Shepherd Park maybe? And it's flashing lights and I don't know that it slows down traffic at all, but I just wonder how did Normal come to the conclusion that that was a reasonable way to address at-grade crossing from a heavy residential across a four-lane highway to a park? And I mean, is that something we consider? Or?
Let me just say that, there's always the manual on uniform traffic control devices. But what I have seen with Normal is sometimes they press the envelope. Sometimes even if the manual may not be right on point, sometimes they have, you know, maybe done pilot projects like that. And I think we need to be more creative, innovative in pushing some of those envelopes as well in some of our crossings. But we'd have to probably get with Normal and find exactly, did they do an engineering study, which the manual requires, et cetera, before putting up some of that signage. But keep in mind, the council can always overrule engineering studies, staff recommendation, and I believe Normal has probably been a little bit more prone to try something like that, to see if it would enhance safety. Um, so.
Okay. Again, Alderman Fazzini, Lauer, and Millawamboy.
Thank you. Uh, First wanted to support Alderman Painter's passion and eloquence. I agreed with all but one thing, all but one. And that one is I don't think I'd go with any of the four options, as the city manager's pointed out. But if I were going to vote on any of them, the only one I'd vote yes on is number one, where we share. And thank you for your passion.
Alderman Lauer.
I agree with both, and kind of brings to mind some issues that have lasted for many, many decades, probably outlives me, on South Bunn Street that's unincorporated. And I've actually been subject to crossing underneath and over Veterans Parkway in that area as I walk my precincts. And I'm not the only one. We have young people that do it and have done it, for a lifetime. So I think you've got both sides of the coin right there. It's a safety issue, but on the other hand, I'm starting to think about, and it brings to mind a fire station that we built because we thought we were going to expand in that direction. And boy, we can spend a lot of money and then not end up going that way. So really, I kind of agree with Mr. Fazzini. I'm not sure that I really like any of these. I certainly am not prone to accepting number one, and I'm leaning very hard towards number three, putting things off until we actually know what we would be doing, and not investing in infrastructure that probably would not be used or maybe even needed. And we probably ought to be putting some money in some areas that it really is required right now. So without being lengthy, there's, it's a conundrum. Thank you.
Okay. Alderman Millawamboy, did you have a point? Your light was off then, but.
Well, I'll just make a really brief point. I do think that none of the four options are the greatest, but yes, I would go with number one if I was pressed for it. But at the same time, I also think that, you know, each party stands to benefit from it. You know, I've seen in a number of situations where, for example, in the example of parks, you know, where, you know, either whether it's a developer or, you know, realtor or whoever, you know, would mention that the park benefits the whole area, you know, so it increases the value of people's property. So I do think in this particular case, I mean, if you have a trail like that, which is pretty attractive, you know, it would certainly benefit the developer to be able to sell, you know, whatever lots, you know, they had or whatever houses they have. So to me, I think the fair thing to do would be at least for them to have a you know a stake in it financially and put some money forward. Um, One other thing I do think, you know, there still needs maybe a little bit more research that needs to be done. We need to have more information, but I'm also curious about the you know, safe routes to schools. I'm not that familiar with the program, but I was wondering if there was anything that could be done there, or if the funding is tapped out, or, you know, do we have an opportunity there to do something additional?
Just briefly, keep in mind with the council's authorization, we still have a pending application for funding to blacktop or put a hard surfacing on the trail, but that is more located out in the Kickapoo Creek wetlands preserve area itself. It doesn't necessarily come up to where we're talking about specifically, but this trail would eventually, you know, connect with that where the hard surfacing could take kids from the west side to the east side underneath that tunnel at Black Oaks, is it Black Oaks Boulevard, and then into Benjamin. So beyond that, I'm not sure. There is trail money that oftentimes does come up through the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So, you know, there is potential to make application for those dollars in the future as well.
Okay. All right. I think at this point, the city manager, do you have I mean, I think there's some consensus here. I didn't hear anybody um, say much other than number one or maybe number three, or nothing. I think that's what we're getting. Yeah.
And Mayor, I'd like to at least ask the council if they would like to hear from the attorney from the developers. We do have Elizabeth Megley that we've had, Jeff has been in contact with. Uh, you know, it's up to you, but she has come here tonight. And if you'd like to hear from her from the perspective of the developer,
Sure. Well, we do have a few
I'm
minutes.
sure she would
so
be willing to speak to you.
Liz,
Okay.
come forward.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I, as indicated, I represent the developers in this matter, and certainly we have a different way of looking at this, and it's primarily due to the fact that throughout the process, any developer looks at the engineering process as a way of determining how expensive their development's going to be and how to budget for a development and whether it's really even economically feasible to move forward with a development. In this particular case, there were two plans presented. There was a preliminary plan, which was approved. There was then an amended plan, which was approved. Both of those plans included an underground pedestrian tunnel near the school, and I think everyone was in agreement that that was appropriate, and the developers covered part of that cost. What it did not ever include was an underground pedestrian tunnel at Kickapoo Creek Road. And this was after a number of discussions between engineering and the developers. Once again, they provided their plan. No underground tunnel was suggested that it should be added to that plan. Based upon that, they made decisions as to how they were going to develop. When you get into a situation like this where they then are told, now you must install an underground pedestrian tunnel at a significant cost or else not proceed, in essence, with development, their response to, in essence, suggest they won't proceed is twofold. One of which is this is not what they had planned on incurring this expense. It wasn't part of the annexation agreement. It wasn't part of the plan. And certainly nobody can suggest that underground pedestrian tunnels weren't considered. They were on the plan in one place. The other part of it is that there is a frustration that the developers can't count on what they see. And I think that frustration that we can no longer count on our planning process, our engineering process as a means of determining what plans we can or can't move forward with is also driving this decision that in the event the city would say, look, to develop further west, we just won't develop it, is really, it's driven by those two factors, cost of this particular project, and frustration in the overall process. I can also report that in conversations with my clients, they've indicated to me that this being one particular situation is really driving their desire and intention to do further development within Bloomington, just because of a frustration of not being able to count on what they see coming back. Developers, like anyone else, are affected by the economy, and the additional cost really does make a difference because it's eventually passed on to homeowners. And if the homes in that price point simply can't bear the additional infrastructure costs, developers can't afford to develop them. With respect to your particular concern regarding building homes that no one's going to move into, certainly the developers have no desire to do that either. They are not going to move into another phase of the development until they feel comfortable that there are individuals out there who are interested in purchasing those particular parcels. I think I can also accurately reflect that my clients have indicated if the council does tell them they have to proceed with a cost sharing or not develop, they will consider any and all other options available to them in enforcing their agreement with the city and their requirements and obligations under the plans as they were approved. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. The only other issue I wanted to briefly touch on is the school crossing issue. Certainly if the underground pedestrian tunnel is not put in place, there is a process by which the school district can determine that that's a hazardous crossing. That's determined by considering a number of factors. If it's determined to be a hazardous crossing, then they can bus the students within 1.5 miles of the school without directly incurring that cost because they would have cost reimbursement from the state.
Questions? Alderman Troy.
I'd just like to make a comment that this is much bigger than the Grove, so don't take this that it's pointed to the Grove, but, you know, we talk a lot about being a business-friendly community in a real broad sense and friendly to the small business person. And I think we would be surprised as a council as to, if you looked at our 5 top home builders in the community, I think we'd be surprised at how many homes they're building outside of the community. Champaign, Peoria, Morton, and that's where they find the most friendly business environment. And there's a lot of people that make choices right now to live in Decatur, Peoria, Champaign, Morton, Bloomington, and maybe a 20 or 30 or 40 minute drive isn't out of the question. So it'd be an interesting number to know, and I don't know if you take top 3, 4, or 5 builders, but there's a lot of them going out of town, and that's where the business-friendly environment is. So that's, I want to say that, make sure I say that in a broader range than just the Grove.
Alderman Fazzini.
Yeah, I'm going to have to echo that coming from the private sector where we did a lot with the developers. If the developers can't trust the city and the city can't feel that the developers are being treated fairly because we, the city, accepted agreements that maybe we look back on and decide we shouldn't have, that's on us. That's not on the developer. The developers signed these in good faith. We prepared them, and I want to make it a real point, in good faith with whom we were dealing at that time. I don't think we have a right now to look back and say, we shouldn't have done that, so the developer should let us amend the agreements to what we want now. What we signed, we signed. What the developers signed, they signed. We have a moral, ethical, and legal obligation to gain the trust of the developers and do what we said we would do. If we want to change going forward, that's fine. And I think the developers would say the same thing, at least the ones who are my customers would. And then they'll decide to do what Jim just said. If we can't make money building in Bloomington, then we'll build in Champaign or Peoria or Danville or anywhere else. And that's a decision that you make in a free market, and that's fine. And I think our developers would all say, and that's fine. But let's stick to what we said.
Just as a clarification, uh, in spite of the recession and all the other issues and maybe even the rumor mill about State Farm, we're still gaining, and we may not this year, but as of after 2010, we've gained 1,000 people a year in Bloomington. 1,000 from 2010 to 11, 11 to 12, and 12 to 13. Actually, a little over 1,000 people each year. It's just that many of them are just not buying the big homes, with aluminum siding many miles from downtown. They're buying other places, and actually a lot of them renting. So we're experiencing a little bit of the great inversion at this point. We'll see what happens with the 2014 census to see if we still do continue to gain population. Alderwoman Schmidt.
I just want to clarify something. We have, a few of us up here have said that possibly option number one is a viable option for us, but that is different from what you are saying. That option number one was never on your plan, your client's plan. And
That is
from your
correct.
perspective, were we to pursue option number one, it might become a bit more contentious.
I think that is an accurate representation.
Okay. Jim, would you like to clarify?
Mayor,
anything?
could I?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I do want to ask one thing, and I think there's two things here. One, we can go back and request the developer to participate in option one, not to dictate or say that they have to. So again, that in my mind, that's kind of our first approach, is to see if they would be willing to participate. I think to go beyond that, we'd probably need to go into closed session and talk about things that are, would be better discussed in closed session as opposed to open session. So I think right now, that's what I would propose based on what I'm hearing. We can go back and request and see if the developer would be willing and come back to you. I think the indication is it's probably going to be a no, but at least we can make that formal request and bring back to you what the response is.
Right.
I
But
think
it's,
that's
al-
how
it's,
we want
it's
to
also
leave it.
just in terms of policy, right? It's certainly, if from our perspective, we feel like it was a bad agreement in the past, we know though we are bound by some of the terms of the agreement, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do something along the way to prevent Bloomington taxpayers from having to bear even more of the burden in the future. But obviously, we do want consistency. We want to be certainly people to know, whether they're developers or others, that we are going to live by our word. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't some things we can do if we think we're stuck in a bad deal. So we'll continue to have that discussion. Anything else from our,
Just
Liz?
briefly, I can report I did talk with all of my clients this week because I wanted to make sure, or I'm sorry, last week, I wanted to make sure when I came to the council that I knew exactly where they all stood on this particular issue, didn't want to make any misrepresentations. I think I can, with 100% certainty, report that they would reject any formal offer to cost share. Certainly you're welcome to make it. I also know that it is their desire to resolve this one way or another, so that they can make long-term decisions about how they're going to proceed.
Right. And just in fairness to everybody, so that everybody knows, Ms. Megley and I think Jim Karch and our city manager met with many of the developers several months ago, and I did in my office say that I think that regardless of, obviously I agree with Alderwoman Painter, that the Grove decision was a very bad one for many, many, many reasons, but that we did want to have some degree of consistency as we went forward. But that also doesn't necessarily mean that we can't insist on some things if we think it's reasonable for the long-term future of the city and our taxpayers. So anyway, Alderwoman Painter, last word.
I do have one more question.
Certainly.
What is the average cost of a home in the Grove?
You know what, I would have to go back and look. I don't want to make a misrepresentation as to what that cost is, and I don't know if that cost varies. Um, my understanding would be it would be in the $250,000 range, and it may be a little higher than that, but like I said, I would be happy to report back to the council.
I can add to a little bit of that because I happen to be I have a house on the market that's at 320, and our main competition was the Grove that is up to 340. So they're in the early threes. There may be some in the 200s, but I think most of them are in the threes. Is that you're nodding, Jim? I don't remember the exact prices, but oh gosh, that's right. Jeez. Oh man, I've got a friendly neighborhood realtor here. Yeah, Alderman Fruman.
Without looking at it closer, I agree with those statements made. We all read the monthly reports that come out of the local real estate, and the average new price, new construction, is $275.
Throughout the city.
Throughout Bloomington normal, $275, and that's been stable for a few years. And but obviously the Grove is going to be higher than that.
Okay.
Okay, so the average cost of a house is more than $244,000, but yet $244,000 is cost prohibitive for them. Why?
The question comes down to planning. It's the same thing for the council as it is for developers or any business. They plan when they enter into development what that cost is going to be and how that cost shares over the entirety of a subdivision. And when you're hit with a $300,000 or $244,000 expense, that's significant to homeowners because that cost does eventually get passed along.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
Any follow-up? Okay. I think we're done, and actually on a perfect time. We barely have 30 seconds. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Moved by Alderman Black, second by Alderwoman Schmidt. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. And we will take a 1-minute break and come back for township. And I got to be true to my statement and get downstairs.